Good morning, good day. Greetings to you wherever you are. You are tuned in to the Octo-Finals of the International Reparation Debate Competition for 2026. This is day two. So far, four teams have secured their spot in the quarterfinals of this competition. Only four slots remain. I want to thank, of course, some of our dear partners and sponsors who have been instrumental in allowing us to have this competition. And of course, some of those partners and sponsors that I'd really like to take the opportunity to give a special thank you are the University of the West Indies, the Center for Reparation Research, the UE Press, Jade Limited, the University of Hull, and our main partner, the Repair Campaign. I am Ravon Thomas Matthews, and I'll be your chair judge for today. Joining me on my panel are two lovely ladies who will help me to decide the outcome of this match. And I'll ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Miss Dejanay Fagan.
Good morning, everyone. I am Dijani Fagan, and I look forward to a very spirited debate. All the best, teams.
Thank you very much. And of course, Miss Rashana Jarrett.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Roshana Jarrett, and I too am looking forward to an excellent clash of ideas, and may the better team win.
Thank you very much. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, the two teams who will be vying to secure one of only four remaining spots in the quarterfinals. In proposition, we have Queen's College from Guyana, and in opposition, Our Lady of Fatima College from Trinidad and Tobago. I would like to hear from these debaters. I'd like to invite Queen's College to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mehi Sabudu, and I will be the first speaker.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rafael Joseph, and I will be your second speaker this morning.
Good morning, everyone. I'm David Sugrim, and I'll be the third speaker for the proposition.
Thank you very much. And of course, the team in opposition, Fatima College.
Hello, my name is Kendi Valley. I'm the first speaker.
Hello, my name is Adam Alves. I am the second speaker.
Hello, my name is David Scotland, and I am the reply speaker.
Thank you very much. Now, of course, ladies and gentlemen, we have sitting on our panel a distinguished professor, lecturer, senior lecturer, and just well-studied gentleman from the University of Sussex. I'm speaking, of course, about Dr. Paul Gilbert. Good morning, Dr. Gilbert.
Hi, everyone. Really nice to be back again. I learned so much and was really impressed when I was guest judging in the last round. So I'm really looking forward to today.
Indeed. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the motion before us for today reads, this House regrets the romanticization of repatriation in Pan-African movements. Once more, this House regrets the romanticization of repatriation in Pan-African movements. In essence, ladies and gentlemen, this debate questions whether or not we should be celebrating or regretting how beautifully, how wonderfully we think of the concept of repatriation, specifically centered in movements around Pan-Africanism. Of course, like all debates, this one is going to be governed by a format. The format for this debate is, of course, the Jade parliamentary debate format. This format will see the first two speakers presenting their case for 7 minutes. The second two speakers will have 6 minutes, and the third speakers from either team will have 5 minutes to present their case and prove to us why they think their team has won the debate. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time in which no points of information will be allowed. Outside of protected time, points of information are not only allowed, they are absolutely encouraged. Of course, there'll be no points of information during the reply speeches. By this time, you are fully aware of the treat that I'm going to be telling you about, and that is, of course, our cross-examination period. a really engaging period of analysis and question and answers that is unique to the Jade parliamentary format. And I'll tell you a little bit about those two pairs of cross-examination when we get to that delta in the debate. And so, ladies and gentlemen, with all that said, it is my privilege and honor to open this, the fifth match in the Octo-Finals of IRDC 2026. I invite the first speaker from Queen's College, Mahisa Badu, to open this debate.
I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, esteemed judges, speakers of the opposition, fellow team members, and honored guests. The proposition stands firmly in agreement with the motion that this House regrets the romanticization of repatriation in Pan-African movements. Today, we put forth the argument that the idealization of returning to one's homeland in Africa presents unrealistic expectations, oversimplifies cultural realities, and ignores the diversity of diasporic identities. However, before continuing, I would like to mention to our audience that our team does not reject the principles of Pan-Africanism. The proposition acknowledges the importance of reconnecting people of African descent with their erased and lost heritage. Yet, the assumptions of repatriation that have evolved from Pan-Africanism have framed the idea of returning to Africa as a simple or perfect solution. Hence, our central argument doesn't lie on whether reconnection with one's African heritage is valuable, but rather that the romanticization of migrating to Africa in hopes of cultural enlightenment is not beneficial to the African diaspora. Pan-Africanism was born out of the desperate need to combat racial exploitation of those with African heritage and unite the African diaspora. For centuries under chattel slavery, people of African descent were indoctrinated to believe that anything associated with African culture was heathen, ugly, or inferior. Yet, despite what belittling beliefs have passed through generations, movements arose to unite those of African descent towards a dreamland known as Mother Africa. The initiation of this Back to Africa movement began with the philosophies of the infamous Marcus Garvey in the early 1900s. Garveyism entailed central ideas of Black nationalism and pride, where he believed that Black people should be able to sustain themselves in all aspects. In regards to this principle, when referring to the Back to Africa movement, he emphasized the need for a place where Black people could govern themselves and create a society free from colonialism and racism. Now, notice how he never framed returning to Africa as the ultimate solution for escaping hardship. In the rise of popularity of Garveyism, the crux of his principles were watered down into the belief that
Point of information.
denied that returning to Africa is the ultimate solution to oppression experienced in the diaspora. His vision was transformed from a call from empowerment into a simplified promise of escape. Stemming from this belief comes a myriad of misinformation. Political science researcher Leanne Mulder shows that in extreme cases, some followers have developed highly romanticized ideas of Africa, believing it to be a unified country with one government, a literal New Jerusalem, or even a place where discrimination and hardship do not exist. Such portrayals create a deeply misleading narrative that Africa is a paradise and that people of African descent can simply return and immediately belong. In reality, that is far from the case. Africa is not a single nation, but a vast and diverse continent with complex political, social, and economic realities. Like many parts of the world, African societies continue to face challenges such as inequality, political instability, and social conflict, which largely stems from prior European colonization. Sounds familiar? Reports from Amnesty International 2024 highlight the ongoing human rights concerns in countries such as Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Libya. Ignoring these realities contributes to a dangerously simplified narrative. Aside from the many socio-political conflicts that are very much prevalent today, the response of the Africans to repatriates has not been as accepting and benevolent as one may assume. A good example of this would be in Ghana, where attitudes to Jamaican Rastafarian lifestyles in Ghana were formally investigated by anthropologist Carmen M. White. Her research revealed that repatriates faced discrimination and social exclusion in Ghana. Rastafarian cultural practices such as wearing dreadlocks, smoking cannabis, and rejecting conventional economic systems were often perceived by local communities as a sign of mental instability and poverty. Hence, Rastafarians are often discriminated against finding their employment, and children are perceived by local communities as a sign as negative influences in these schools. To make things worse, emerging from the genocidal wars in Rwanda, terrorist groups were labeled as Rasta rebels, despite having no connections to Rastafarianism. Newspapers headline,
Point of information.
denied, Rastaman runs amok, and court remands Rastafarian for rape, without even verifying that the suspects were indeed Rastafarian, perpetuates harmful discrimination against the repatriates. Is this not the same injustice the Rastafari were trying to escape by repatriating? Rastarod commented on his experience. Most not happy to see us coming. Most don't see us like brothers and sisters. They see us as foreigners. I ask this assembly today, what part of this experience is worth glamorizing? Romanticization replaces one set of struggles with another without preparing individuals for either. However, this does not signify the end of Pan-Africanism. In the 21st century, there has been a shift in perspectives regarding repatriation. Pan-Africanists across Barbados, Guyana, and Jamaica, Mulder 2019, are reporting that repatriation and self-liberation starts as a mentality rather than a physical migration. Many Rastafarians fight against Babylon in their own local context, without depending on the safety net of reparation to catch them. Amdi Selassie, an elder in Jamaica, argued that, so if we cannot fight for equal rights and justice right where we are, when we go to wherever, how are you going to fight to get your equal rights? This demerits the perspective of repatriation as a need to escape inequality, instead reframing the dependency mindset to one of self-emancipation. As Kwame Nkrumah wisely declared, I am not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. The strength of Pan-Africanism, therefore, does not lie in the myth of a perfect return, but in the shared identity that connects people of African descent, regardless of where they choose to fight their battles. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was the first speaker from Queens, Mahisa Budu. At this point in time, we invite the first speaker from Fatima College to open the day, to open the debate for side opposition. That speaker, of course, being Kennedy Valley.
Can I be heard?
Loud and clear. Ready when you are.
Okay. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. We reclaim the Prime Minister's quote. The first Ghanaian president, Kwame Nkrumah, captured it best. I am not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. The opposition stands firm. We will not regret the romanticization of repatriation because it is a crucial ideological foundation of Pan-African unity and action. Before I proceed, definitions. Pan-Africanism is the political, intellectual, and cultural movement advocating the unity and solidarity and empowerment of people of African descent globally. Romanticization of repatriation refers to the idealized belief that the African diaspora belongs to and should return to Africa, that Africa remains their homeland even after centuries of separation. This appears in initiatives like the Ghanaian Year of Return, inviting the diaspora home. We say that this romantic idea has never actually caused mass migration, but rather an ideology of belonging and independence that has mobilized millions, which has the most scale in weighing this debate. My 2 points are, 1, romanticization created the ideological force that mobilized global Black unity, and 2, romanticization is not fanciful, it actively drives economic and political transformation today. My first claim is that romanticizing repatriation created an ideological structure for a globally fragmented people. Because of slavery, millions of Africans were stolen from their home, severing connections to land, language, and legacy. Reconnection came in the form of this romantic ideal. Repatriation was romanticized in Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement in the 1920s. According to the Journal of African American History, Garvey's movement mobilized over 11 million members globally and had 1,100 chapters worldwide. It spread messages of racial pride and Black unity through the newspaper Negro World, which amassed hundreds of thousands of readers. The movement also established businesses through the Negro Factories Corporation, creating economic opportunities for Black communities systematically excluded from white labor markets. The proposition claims back to Africa as a Black nationalist movement for their side, which is essentially wrong. Garveyism is premised on Africa as a paradise, and not just as an escape, but a project to return and free Africa from colonial rule as our ultimate home. But crucially, this mobilization did not happen because people were physically returning to Africa. It happened because they believed in Africa as their ultimate homeland. That ideology created collective identity, political consciousness, and global solidarity. And this ideological force extended beyond Marcus Garvey. A study published in Caribbean Quarterly shows that the religion of Rastafari was premised on the romanticized belief of repatriation, positioning Africa, specifically Ethiopia, as the spiritual homeland to which Rastafarians are destined to return. This is as essential as the myth of Jesus on the cross in Christianity. The Prime Minister talked about how Rastafaris were judged in Ghana. Mr. Speaker, Rastafari would not exist without romanticization. Rastafari has had invaluable global impact. The BBC estimates there are approximately 1 million Rastafarians globally. Rastafari created a shared cultural identity across the diaspora, from dreadlocks and dress to symbols of red, green, and gold, giving people a tangible way to reclaim African heritage after centuries of displacement. This ideology then spread globally through reggae music, which was crucial in Pan-African liberation movements. According to BBC Archives, the icon Bob Marley's song Zimbabwe directly supported Zimbabwe's liberation movement and was performed at its independence in 1980. Reggae music consistently promoted Pan-African unity and liberation in songs like Bob Marley's Africa Unite, Redemption Song, and Get Up, Stand Up. So, Mr. Speaker, even though Back to Africa and Rastafari did not actualize mass repatriation, without the belief of a return home, you do not get Back to Africa, you do not get Rastafari, you do not get reggae as forces for Pan-African unity and liberation. My second point is that romanticization drives real and economic and political transformation. Romanticization is not a fairy tale. It is the motivation that drives real-world development, policy, and integration. Firstly, romanticization drives participation. According to migration and development studies in the World Development Journal, diasporic engagement significantly increases when individuals feel cultural and ancestral connection to a homeland. That means skilled professionals return. That means investors contribute. That means diaspora networks build economies. Repatriation is not an escape, but investment and reconstruction. We see this most clearly in Ghana, a key center of diasporic repatriation, which actively framed itself as a homeland through initiatives like the Year of Return. This is going to clash with their conflict between the Rastafari and the people in Ghana. At Ghana's independence, this romanticized idea of return drew Pan-African intellectuals to build the state. For example, American-born W.E.B. Du Bois relocated to Ghana and produced the Encyclopedia Africana, a monumental record of social, cultural, and historical African knowledge which challenged Western stereotypes. Today, Ghana uses that same idea of homecoming to drive economic transformation. The Year of Return boosted tourism and diaspora engagement, now one of the country's largest foreign exchange sources, according to Science Direct. This continues through Beyond the Return, which promotes diaspora investment in infrastructure, agriculture, and real estate, while easing pathways to citizenship. Furthermore, according to a 2013 socioeconomic study at the University of Cape Coast, 84% of Ghanaian repatriates return with critical professional and technical skills that help prevent brain drain and sustain a skilled labor force. Romanticization transforms Africa from a foreign place into a homeland people invest in, the point of Pan-Africanism, strengthening both Ghana and broader Pan-African unity. So the proposition is not regretting some fantasy. They are removing a motivation for Pan-African movement for progress. Mr. Speaker, we are not here to defend mass migration, but an ideology that mobilized millions, an ideology that has started movements and religions like Rastafari. an ideology that brings a fragmented family together again. We cannot regret that. We are so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. That was the first speaker from Team Fatima College, Kennedy Valley. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised you something fun, and we're at that point in the debate. We're in the first period of cross-examination. For this segment, we will see the team in opposition pose 3 questions to the team in proposition. Each question will last no more than 10 seconds, and each answer will last no more than 45 seconds. Importantly, for the team asking the question, only one person may do so at a time. However, for the team answering the question, the entire team can chime in to provide the most comprehensive and robust answer possible, as long as it fits within that 45-second window. After opposition has asked their 3 questions and they've been answered by proposition, we will invite proposition to pose their 3 questions. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, let us get into this first period of cross-examination. We invite the first question to be posed by Queen's College.
You can use that.
Thank you.
Okay.
You claimed that repatriation to Africa allows for a collective identity, but is that to say that our Caribbean identity should be neglected or undermined?
No, not at all. My second speaker is going to talk about this. The thing is, when you have a narrative like romanticization, it is something people opt into. The same way vegans opt into the romanticization of animal rights and believing animals have feelings which need to be valued. You opt into that narrative. Just because people are vegan doesn't mean I have to be vegan. There's no one forcing you to repatriate, no one telling you your identity isn't valuable. It's if you want to opt into that.
And also what we are saying is that as a movement and as an idea, the romanticization had its benefits for the people who believed in it. And what we're trying to say is that without it, the world wouldn't, like, there's no tangible reason to say that the world would have been a better place without it when it has done things to help people and cultures across the world.
Thank you. My next question is that you argue that Africa is the promised land. Can you explain why you continue to ignore evidence of political and complex diversity in African states itself, such as discrimination against Rastafarians in Ghana and the political time?
So while we understand that Africa may not be the ideal promised land that we speak about, the idea is larger than that in the sense that Africa was in the promised land in the sense that in the post-colonial society, if you put it in context, Black Africans had no rights, they couldn't vote, they couldn't get education, they couldn't buy land. Africa symbolized a place where, at the very least, they could have been considered human beings. And we'd say that a promised land for someone who lived in a post-colonial society would have been somewhere where they could have just had basic human rights.
Thank you. You've emphasized that Pan-Africanism promotes Black unity and that returning to Africa strengthens identity. How do you reconcile this with the fact that Caribbeans themselves have their own distinct identity that is separate to any African diaspora?
Well, we would say that's kind of a repetition of your first question. And same thing with my second speaker, because you opt into the choice to believe that narrative of romanticization, and you can choose to opt out of it. No one's forcing you to repatriate. It's a choice.
We are not saying that we want to eradicate our own Caribbean identity. We are saying that we are unifying ourselves as one, and that idea is valuable and has been shown to be valuable in many different instances.
And also one thing I'd like to point is that we contend that, in fact, the problem is that we believe that there's this great separation between us simply because of different culture. Cultural separation doesn't separate us as individuals. We can still collaborate with each other. We can still believe that Africa is a homeland while accepting differences. And it's this division that we believe exists is what causes a lot of the societal problems today, which is similar to what happened with slavery, where they divided us based on our differences, which we contend is a problem.
That is time. Thank you very much. Those were the 3 questions from Team Proposition. At this point in time, we invite the team in opposition, Fatima College, to pose their questions.
Okay. Wait, before I start, I think at some point in my speech, I called Jesus on the cross a myth. That was just because I was speaking off the cuff. I go to a religious school. I did not mean that. I go to a Catholic
Defend
school.
your faith indeed. No
Yeah.
worries.
Okay. So okay. Okay. So my first question is that you claim back to Africa as a point for your side, even though Garvey essentially believed in genuinely returning to Africa with the Black Star Line, which was meant to ship people back to Africa. How do you contend with that?
I contend with that by saying that Garvey mainly focused on Black nationalism and unity. And although he initiated the Back to Africa movement, the ideals of that movement were romanticized and contorted to make it seem that repatriation was the only solution to emancipating yourself from mental slavery.
Exactly. Garvey would have preached that returning to Africa could be seen as a way for us to develop or gain solidarity. But people have shifted that idea now into that Africa is the only way in which we can regain that identity, that collective unity as a people.
And we must take the movement and we must translate it now to the reality base that is now at the present moment.
Okay, second question, a follow-up question. You talk about how Back to Africa idealized repatriation, but that was the mechanism through which he motivated those people. And furthermore, when you talk about the reality now, which is one of things like civil rights and that sort of thing, you have to contend with the fact that it evolved from Garveyism.
We do acknowledge the impact that Garveyism had in motivating the people to unite themselves in the African diaspora. However, that idealization is not realistic in today's standards compared with the diversity of both the African diaspora and the African continent.
And what we must work on is a global network of Africans everywhere. And so what you're positing is actually a very small-minded idea to a much larger issue that has to be dealt with no matter the confines of a border.
Okay, so the next question is, you are positing that we have idealized going back to Africa. And what we are trying to say is that the ideology, that the belief of going back to Africa is what pushed these movements, not the actual repatriation of people who went back to Africa. So you're talking about this idealized space that they return to. We are saying that people didn't return to Africa en masse, but the belief is what pushed these movements. How do you contend with that?
I contend with that, and that the definition of romanticization, according to the Collins Dictionary, means the presenting of something that is unrealistic to today's standards. So when we say we regret the romanticization of repatriation, we're regretting the distortion of the context of Garveyism and Pan-Africanist movements.
We're regretting the negative impact that this romanticization will have. We're not only talking about the people that actually moved there, we're speaking about everyone that actually has this ideology. And when they think of it in that way, when they go back to Africa we, as my first speaker mentioned, all of the negative things in Africa, making it a dreamland or paradise, as we both agree, as you just agreed with us in your in answering our question, you do not believe Africa is a dreamland. And it's the same ideology that we are now saying is false and has a bad rhetoric.
All right, thank you very much for that first period of cross-examination to both teams. With that said, we invite the second speaker from Queen's College to extend the case for side proposition. That speaker, Raphael Joseph.
All right. Honorable members of the opposition and esteemed guests.
I'm not hearing
Sorry,
you.
excuse me. Yeah, sorry.
You guys can't hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, let me come up closer.
And you can,
All right.
we'll restart the time. Ready when you're ready, Raphael.
All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, Mr. Speaker, learned judges, honorable members of the opposition, and esteemed guests. Mr. Speaker, building on the strong foundation set by our first speaker, who demonstrated that the romanticization of repatriation creates harmful and unrealistic expectations, I will now show that it goes even further. It actively undermines Caribbean identity and distracts from meaningful reparatory justice. Let me be clear. We do not reject Pan-Africanism. We recognize its historical importance in promoting unity, pride, and resistance among people of African descent. However, we firmly oppose the romanticization of repatriation because it implies that the Caribbean identity is incomplete or inferior. Mr. Speaker, our case as proposition rests on two key points. Firstly, romanticization of repatriation undermines the legitimacy of Caribbean identity. Secondly, it distracts Caribbean societies from pursuing real, structured reparatory justice. Mr. Speaker, in the Caribbean, particularly in societies like Guyana and Jamaica, identity has not remained static. It has been forged through centuries of slavery, colonialism, resistance, and cultural mixing. As sociologist M.G. Smith would have posited through the concept of Creole society, Caribbean identity is not a diluted version of African identity. It is a new, legitimate, born identity out of historical experience. So I ask this House, if Caribbean identity is real and valid, why must it always be qualified in such terms as Afro-Guyanese, African-American? Why is there a constant pressure to return in order to be complete?
Point of information.
Denied. Mr. Speaker, the answer is simple. Because the romanticization of repatriation suggests that our identity is unfinished, that we are somehow incomplete without Africa. This is where the work of William E.B. Du Bois becomes critical. Through his concept of double consciousness, he explains that individuals in the diaspora already navigate multiple identities. However, romanticizing repatriation falsely suggests that this tension can only be resolved by physically returning to Africa. Mr. Speaker, that is not repatriation, that is erasure. Similarly, Paul Gilroy reminds us that shared experience of slavery created a unique diasporic identity, one rooted in struggle, survival, and cultural innovation. This identity does not need to be abandoned or
Point of information.
through relocation. Denied. Therefore, when repatriation is romanticized, it does not strengthen identity. It delegitimizes Caribbean existence by implying that we do not fully belong where we are. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, romanticizing repatriation distracts from the real issue facing Caribbean people in the pursuit of reparatory justice. In the Caribbean, reparations are not abstract. They are a response to centuries of slavery, exploitation, and underdevelopment. Institutions such as the CARICOM Reparations Commission have already outlined structured approaches to addressing these injustices, including debt cancellation, investment in education, and psychological rehabilitation. But, Mr. Speaker, if we are constantly being told to return to Africa, then who is responsible for repairing the damage done here in the Caribbean? Certainly not the former colonial powers who benefit from that destruction.
POI.
Denied. By romanticizing repatriation, we shift focus away from holding those powers accountable and instead promote the illusion that leaving the Caribbean is a form of justice. Mr. Speaker, that is not justice. That is avoidance. The opposition may argue that repatriation strengthens identity and unity among people of African descent. However, we argue that it does the exact opposite. It suggests that the Caribbean identity is broken and must be repaired through relocation. That is not empowerment. That is erasure. It oversimplifies the unique struggles of the Caribbean diaspora and creates an easy escape route for those who should be held accountable. Instead, we don't get our reparations because of this. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the romanticization of repatriation undermines Caribbean identity, and the Caribbean is not a temporary space. It is a place where identity has been forged through struggle, resilience, and cultural creation. To romanticize repatriation is to suggest that this identity is not enough. We firmly reject this notion. Reparations are not about abandoning the Caribbean. It's about affirming and repairing it. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Raphael Joseph, second speaker from Queen's College. Now, to extend the debate for Fatima College, we invite their second speaker, Adam Alves.
Okay, I will be beginning in 3, 2, 1. The opposition claims that false hope and giving people, our people, something to latch onto and mobilize with is wrong. Romanticizing repatriation gives us hope. It gives the diaspora something to move towards that has made waves. We argue that hope, whether false or not, can unify people, just like Martin Luther King's dream in the civil rights movement. For the romanticization of repatriation, hope spawned movements like Rastafari, and even today it continues to influence movements like the recent repatriation of colonial artifacts back to Benin from Cambridge University. And we can never regret that. To continue, the government claims that a perfect return and the paradise of Africa does not exist in any way. However, that ignores the historical and geopolitical context of the movement at the time. We contend that the very act of escaping colonial societies justifies the romanticization of the repatriation movement. Allow me to remind the audience of the conditions faced by our ancestors within the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the United States, Black communities lived under Jim Crow segregation. African Americans lived in fear of horrible psychological and physical torment. And to show you scale, the Black Holocaust Museum reported that approximately over 4,000 African Americans were lynched between 1882 and 1930, the same time as the Back to Africa movement. And even today, the Federal Bureau of Prisons report that Black Americans have roughly a 6 times higher rate of incarceration than white citizens. Economic and social mobility was another grave issue, not just within the United States, but throughout all colonial and ex-colonial powers at the time. In the Caribbean, a UN report stated that Africans were limited to clerical positions and denied prestigious roles based upon their race. The government today forgets where we are repatriating from. Our people have suffered and are still suffering untold injustice socially, psychologically, and physically within these colonial societies. Escaping this suffering and untold pain in any capacity has to be respected. No, it has to be romanticized. This was an act of liberation. Ladies and gentlemen, a promised land. Because merely leaving the societies which ridiculed and tortured us has to be coined as a victory for our diaspora. Moreover, the repatriation movement has to be recognized and appreciated because it created something even when the whole world was against them. The government emphasizes the failures of the repatriation movement, but forgets to mention where these failures come from. Not from our own people or our own failed ideologies, but rather from European meddling and stifling of our movements. For example, when Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association attempted to establish agricultural and economic projects in Liberia in the 1920s, he was framed and deported for mail fraud by J. Edgar Hoover. All this because white governments and international business interests all feared the emergence of an independent Black economic network. Similarly, early diaspora settlers in Sierra Leone and Liberia struggled, not because settlers lacked vision, but because European colonial structures controlled trade routes, capital flows, and political recognition, like when the British abused Liberia's initial dependence on imports by spiking prices of all manufactured goods. And despite all these obstacles, pains, and woes, the repatriation movement still had some success. The Black political independence, the economic freedom, the ability to own the land in which you stand on. They accomplished something rather than nothing. And that is truly commendable and an instance to be romanticized. This leads me to my next point. This movement should be romanticized because of the undoubtable moral worth seen in repatriation. A moral worth which should not be minimized or brought down, because at its core, the repatriation movement gave people something profoundly important: the freedom of choice, to choose what life they were to live. If your opinion is that our colonial societies were better off than Africa, fine. If your opinion is that Africa was better off than our colonial societies, fine. But the opinion of either the government or the opposition is irrelevant here. The fact is that it is laudable to give anyone a choice which fundamentally dispels the initial harm of the forced migration of 12.5 million Africans in the Middle Passage. The ability to choose to leave the fragmented colonial society we were forced into is a profound moral step forward. It allows individuals to determine their own future. And as Black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois said, it is the logical and necessary step towards the redemption of the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, we, the opposition, urge you that we must not, we must never regret the romanticization of repatriation. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Adam. That was the second speaker from Fatima College. Ladies and gentlemen, the debate presses on. We're in our second period of cross-examination. This time, however, we will invite team opposition to pose their questions first.
Okay, you guys ready? Queens, are you ready?
We're ready.
Okay, cool. Caribbean and African cultural narratives can coexist. I am not forced to be a Rasta because others romanticize it. Your response?
Please repeat.
Caribbean and African cultural narratives can coexist. I am not forced to be a Rasta because others romanticize it. Your response?
No, we're not forced into being anything as such as part of a Pan-African movement. But we need to remember that being born into the Caribbean, that becomes part of our identity. We escaped, well, not escaped, but we were resilient throughout the period of colonialism. At that time, Rastafarianism was seen as a movement to gain identity, not to be oppressed under the boots of the colonizer.
And when the movement constantly presents repatriation as the ultimate solution, it tells the Caribbean diaspora that the answer to colonial injustice lies elsewhere than in the Caribbean. It lies wherever the diaspora are, not just in Africa.
Okay. My second question is repatriation is part of the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparative justice. Isn't psychological healing found for some in return to homeland if they choose it?
Please repeat one more time for me. Thank you.
Repatriation is part of the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice. Isn't psychological healing found in a return to homeland for some if they choose it?
Yeah, that is certainly true. It is found for some, but what about the mass majority of people whose ancestors decided to stay here because resilience was where they found their identity, was where they found their psychological relief from the pressures of colonialism?
And Mr. Speaker, you spoke you're asking about psychological fixing of psychologically, but you just said in your speech that hope, false or not. What we need to solve our issues are not false hope. We need the actual steps to take us to fix the psychological effect that we've gone through.
And to add to that, we're saying that repatriation is possible for Caribbean people. However, instead of romanticizing the process of repatriation, we must take into consider the economic disparities and social disparities that exist in that continent.
Well, as we said before, we believe that, we know that not everybody had that option to repatriate. So who are you to declare that the majority of us wouldn't? We said that European movements stifled us and our ability was prohibited.
Can you repeat your question?
Sorry, that was not the question. That was a continuation to the conversation. Hello?
Oh, wait,
Oh
no,
no,
sorry, you can't do that.
I'll answer the
it
question.
definitely.
What he's
Hold
asking
on,
is that
hold
No, no,
on,
no, I don't think we can.
Fatima. I have credited it as a question.
Yeah, so we can
Okay.
that. Oh, sure. So you
But-
could you could repeat it, yeah.
Can you repeat that, please?
Okay. Are you aware that a large majority of Caribbean communities at the time of the Back to Africa movement did not have the ability to repatriate because they were stifled by European powers?
Is where the romanticization effect falls into play. By romanticizing that this here is an escape from the pressures of life in the Caribbean, we not only now place other people into expense because now they're thinking about, okay, I need to get my family over to Africa. That is where we're going to be safe. But now it's not taken into account that Africa also, again, has social and economic issues that go on right there in the country.
And our stance is on freedom. When we fight for freedom in all of the areas that our African diaspora are, they would have the choice to go back if they want to, but it's not something that would be romanticized. And I also want to note that the year of the return was noted as a major tourism campaign landmark, not just not as framed as what you're framing it to be.
All right, thank you very much, Fatima College, for your 3 questions. At this point in time, we invite Queen's College to pose their 3 questions.
All right. So the first question, how is the hope derived from Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream, which envisions dismantling segregation and achieving unity between Black and white communities, comparable to repatriation, which involves leaving flawed systems and separating communities across continents?
Wait, this is actually really interesting. Okay, so there was always this clash in American society between nationalist and integrationist movements. So Martin Luther King purported one thing, and Malcolm X, who's a Black nationalist and part of the Nation of Islam, would say another thing. The importance is that both of those movements got mass support, and together they were able, in aggregate, to get things like civil rights. So Marcus Garvey is just one iteration of that. And matter of fact, Garveyism actually led Martin Luther King to return to Africa, and he had connections with those societies as well.
Okay. Second question. You argue that reparation helps people escape oppression and rediscover identity. But does this not imply that Caribbean identity shared by centuries of culture, struggle, and resilience are incomplete?
No, we are not saying that it's incomplete at all, but what we are saying is that because we have all of these unique cultures, these unique identities, we are saying that we know that these cultures belong in the world. And what we are saying is that historically, the colonial powers have tried to stifle our cultures. And what we are saying, when we have the belief that we are one, we can go back to Africa and we can all coexist with our different cultures. We're not saying that when you go back to Africa, you assimilate with their culture.
Also,
We are strongest together.
Also, you opt into what culture you want to identify with. So I like soca very much. I'm Trinidadian. I also like reggae music. I can choose both. I can choose African culture and Caribbean culture in any way I like.
There's a freedom of choice.
Okay, thank you. Final question. You emphasize the oppression faced by African Americans under Jim Crow and systematic barriers in colonial societies. But the world has changed since the early 20th century. How does romanticizing repatriation today, when the Caribbean and African societies are politically and socially distinct from the society at that time?
Romanticizing repatriation today is valuable because some people within our still colonial societies are oppressed even to this day. With as I said before, even today, the Federal Bureau of Prisons says that African Americans have a 6 times higher incarceration rate. And we know that instances of severe violence amongst our races are still prevalent today. We wish to give people an option to come back.
And what is more, if you look at like the United States and you look at the UK, you would know that there are always predominantly black areas like Brooklyn and whatnot. What our belief, what the romanticizing repatriations does, is it's not entirely about physically hopping on a boat and going back to Africa, but it's about the belief that as a people we are one and that we belong somewhere in this world and that there is somewhere for us to stay and that there is a promised land and we can achieve something where we can be free. It's not entirely about hopping on a boat and going back to Africa. It's about belonging.
All right, thank you very much to both teams for that second period of cross examination. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point in time, there are only two speeches left in this debate. Those are the reply speeches. In the reply speeches, both teams will be trying their very best to convince the judges why their team has won. To aid them in that regard, we will now have a 1 minute break so that they can finalize their thoughts. That 1 minute break starts now.
One minute, everyone.
All right, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very enlightening and rich debate thus far. To conclude this debate for the team in opposition, Fatima College, we invite their third and final speaker, David Scotland.
Can I be heard?
Loud and clear, David.
I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, in the attempt to demonize romanticizing reparations, the proposition has assuaged the strife of our ancestors to mere failures and being meaningless. The opposition completely rejects that. Firstly, we never said that romanticizing repatriations is the ultimate solution. And I would like to pose one question to the proposition. If not this, then what else? What world do you propose exists without romanticization of repatriations? Mr. Speaker, the proposition alluded to the idea that romanticizing repatriations removes Caribbean identity and suggests that it is broken. But in rebuttal, Mr. Speaker, that is not true. In fact, we contend that it strengthens our identity and it is strengthened by forming a deeper bond of who we are. We never said that when we repatriate, we must assimilate to African cultures and relinquish ours. We are saying that because of our unique and precious cultures, it is important for us to realize that we are important and our culture belongs in this world. In their attacks, the proposition fabricates cultural barriers which led to discrimination. They advocate for separation. We advocate for unity. For example, Libya was repatriation without romanticization. They believed that Africa was not the homeland for all, which led to the exclusion of the indigenous people because of their unique cultures instead of accepting them. And what happened? The people who repatriated to Libya became presidents and officials, while the indigenous people were excluded and discriminated, creating the very same colonial system we thought to escape. And furthermore, we advocate that the romanticization of repatriations was the cornerstone of Pan-African movements. My first speaker proposed romanticization being not only the physical return of people, but the ideology derived from Africa being home. And that this ideology was undeniably one of the most treasured possessions of the African people, because it cannot be taken away and corrupted. We proved that this ideology was essential for many of the largest African unity movements in the world, like the Back to Africa movement, and more importantly, the Rastafarian religion, which led to a global influence and is a stamp of Caribbean culture on the world's canvas, all of which would be non-existent without romanticization. They also talked about Africa not being economically stable and not being a promised land. And that right there is the problem, because we explained the economic realities of Africa. But then we rightfully postulated that when the diaspora feels that connection to home, it encourages economic activity and growth by educated or wealthy individuals either returning to help or simply buying vested, driven by the purpose of helping their motherland and their people. Should we leave the people in Africa to suffer by themselves, or should we help our brothers out? Showing that this romanticized ideology is the solution to the economically deprived state of Africa. We also revealed that many of the failures of physical repatriations in Pan-Africanism were mostly due to colonial interference, not romanticization, seen evidently in the unwavering efforts of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA with the Black Star Line, a prospectus project which failed not simply because of a lack of funding, but by the deliberate sabotage by colonial powers and Garvey's arrest and eventual deportation. Mr. Speaker, one man's trash may always be another man's treasure. My second speaker preached the commendability of romanticized repatriations, as it gave the diaspora who lived in grave conditions and experienced discrimination a path to freedom, a path to a new life. This should not be belittled and framed as a failure because many chose not to walk it or could not walk it, or just because Africa was not a haven for wealth for those who escaped the colonial yoke. It should be revered as a way for individuals to feel empowered and the incontestable moral worth of giving individuals the freedom of choice, the freedom of deciding by which hands they suffer. The movement did not force anyone to return, nor did it reprimand those who didn't. Rather, it empowers those who desire to return and form a deeper connection with their homeland, the opportunity to do so. And we see nothing wrong with that. And Mr. Speaker, today, we speak on behalf of all of those who are proud of their lineage, who needed a way to escape their torment, and who want to help their African family. Mr. Speaker, today, we advocate for those who believe there is no place like home. Mr. Speaker, today, we proudly oppose the motion.
Thank you very much. That was, ladies and gentlemen, the final speaker from Team Fatima College, David, Scotland. And now, to conclude the debate, we invite David, this time Sigrid, from Queen's College.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, esteemed members of the opposition and audience, as third speaker for the proposition, I'd like to unequivocally reinstate my colleague's stance in firm unwavering agreement with the moot. The House regrets the romanticization of repatriation in Pan-African movements. As the first speaker stated, romanticization creates false expectations and harm, while the second speaker expanded on this foundation, proving that it undermines our Creole identity. Repatriation in Pan-African movements in the past has contributed to rebuilding pride and to, in effect, foster unity of persons of African descent that was denatured by oppressions from our past. But while this unity is salient, the romanticized idea is not the full solution to the systematic dehumanization and exploitation of African people. These movements must evolve beyond a simple migratory project into a global network. Moving away from the oppressive framework means moving away from dated, romanticized ideals that ignore the reality of the present. I would like to maintain the stance of my colleagues in that romanticized idealism of repatriations in Pan-African movements creates unrealistic illusions, causing harm, and distracts Caribbean societies from pursuing real structured reparatory justice. We, the proposition, are not negating the influence and the salience of these movements, but rather we wish to degrade the imaginative rhetoric of the idea that returning to Africa is a magic or perfect solution. As research unearthed, portraying Africa as an oasis that is alienated to discrimination and hardship, which I'm sure our opposition agrees with, as they stated they don't believe Africa is a promised land, is 100% false, as my first speaker extensively showed. This romanticization is actually counterproductive. Therefore, it sets individuals up for immense disappointment and cultural shock. The opposition has failed to prove that romanticization of repatriation in the Pan-African movement is something positive or a solution that posits benefits to the movement. They've also failed to grasp the full meaning of the mood, the word regret. Let me define it for you, opposition. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, it is defined as a wish that it can become something that it could have been different or better. Also, the word romanticization, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is by definition the process of believing that something is better than it is. A false pretense? Mr. Speaker, from both these definitions, I think we can extrapolate the word better, which is what the proposition wishes to communicate to the audience. The opposition's biggest red flag was the assertion that we, the proposition, are tearing down the entirety of the complex Pan-African movements. This rhetoric is 100% false and misleading to our stance. We are not here to tear down these movements. We, the proposition, are here because we believe the African people deserve something better than a false pretense. The second speaker for the opposition stated, latch on to something for hope, hope false or not. They deserve reality-based solution, real, structured, reparatory justice, not romanticized illusions. The romanticization of reparations is, simply put, a small-minded idea to a much larger issue. We postulate that the romanticization idea of repatriation is dangerous to put forward as a full solution. Unified global Africa? How can we have this if it is romanticized that Africans are to be confined to rigid borderlines? Rebuilding a fractured African world means taking steps to break the very framework that caused distrust. The fixes lie in systematic and global solidarity, wherever Africans are, rather than just physically moving them to an idealized dream. When repatriations is romanticized, it suggests that this tension can only be resolved by physically returning to the motherland, as if it will magically fix who we are. This undermines the legitimacy of our Caribbean identity, and it implies we are not complete to go back. You've said, opposition, that it is not about returning, just about the idea. An idea, a dream, Mr. Speaker. When the movement constantly presents repatriations as the ultimate solution, it tells the Caribbean diaspora that the answers to colonial injustice lies elsewhere. This undermines the politics that will pursue the structured reparatory justice that the Caribbean 10-point, as you stated, outlines. In conclusion, honorable judges, this mood lies in romanticization, and the opposition stance itself is romanticized and out of check with the lived experience of African diaspora. So I conclude to the House, let us not be confused by psychological comfort and illusions with real justice. The proposition is not proposing a dreamlike fix, but reality-based. So I again joined my colleagues in unequivocally calling on the House to reject romanticization and the false expectations. We do not need a band-aid of false pretense. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was David Sigrim, the final speaker from Queen's College and the final speaker for this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, the judges are going to excuse themselves to another space. We will do some deliberation and return to you promptly with the results of this match.
As Queen's College students, we firmly believe that reparations are a way to honor our ancestors' suffering.
Caribbean societies that have emerged from the roots of colonialism and slavery continue to experience generational poverty, even as the region moves towards development.
But why do we even need reparations today? You see, the fact of the matter is, the injustices of imperialism still mold and shape society today.
We believe that the movement for reparations is essential towards the full dismantlement of the colonial mindset that many of us still hold in current times.
So, let us not be chained by the weight of our past any longer. Instead, let us start to make strides towards the changes that the Caribbean actually needs.
Hey, aren't you the guy that stole my wallet?
Oh, excuse me.
You owe me an apology.
Listen, we must not seek to unpick the past, but rather focus on the future.
What? As Dr. Eric Williams understood, Caribbean enslavement and indigenous genocide built up European wealth and left our region scarred and underdeveloped.
Here, take a look. We need reparations. It just makes sense.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this international reparation debate competition. This international reparation debate competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparation so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Equiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All protocols observed, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The burdens. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and 2, the harm is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation, and 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo. The history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. Reform is being done for more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Marus, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use first-hand accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debate, which is already being done, and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust in diverse classroom. This is credible as the RAN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working, as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. it is in the rationale also
Points of
and syllabi
information.
that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring two substantive. One, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And two, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival, reduces emotional harm and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience and understanding. For example, the Holocaust education isn't taught by showing only images of death camps. They come with stories of resistance, survival, and moral courage. It fosters pride, empathy, and moral courage instead of guilt or division. That's why balanced, trauma-informed teaching benefits are supreme. My second warrant is effective, safe teaching already exists and work. We're seeing programs like Facing History and Ourselves offer concrete evidence that teaching hard history can be both emotionally and safe, intellectually enriching. According to a 2021 RAND Corporation study, students in these programs which is a reform program by the way, show that 94% increase in civic agency, meaning they felt more empowered to take social action and reported deeper empathy, stronger historical understanding, and more open-minded attitude. And the fact that we're seeing this in real classroom, Mr. Speaker, proves that harm is not inherent to the topic. It's about how we design the curriculum and support teachers, and we are currently doing this now through reform. If we have models that work, and we do, then the moral burden shifts to improving delivery, not erasing the content. What my third warrant is suppressing this history causes more harm than good. Mr. Speaker, be aware that we're not talking just about the current history. We're talking about the teaching of the history overall, because that's what the mood says. In environments where slavery is ignored or downplayed, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Students grow up believing that slavery was minor, that racism is just a mere relic of the past, or that systemic inequality is simply an overreaction. This ignorance sustains real-world harm, and contrary to this, we're seeing that countries like Germany, who have faced their history head-on with regards to the Holocaust, show lower levels of historical denialism and far-right extremism than those that whitewash. The impact, it promotes social equity and activism, because when students learn this history accurately and empathetically, they become more socially aware, engaged, and ready to challenge injustice. And two, it empowers empathetic, informed citizens who are empowered to fight modern injustice. And three, it protects future generations from repeating justice itself. My second substantive is silence enables racism to thrive. My first warrant is when schools avoid teaching slavery, they leave students with distorted or incomplete narratives. In the absence of formal education, when students are left to piece together understanding from biased media, peer opinions, or online misinformation, the result is a deeply distorted view of race and history. A 2018 SPLC report showed that only 8% of the US high school seniors could identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War. When students believe that slavery was a voluntary arrangement or that racism ended in 1865, it undermines every effort to promote justice and equality today. Silence gives racism plausible deniability that it suggests falsely that if we don't talk about injustice, it must not exist. The impact, it ensures future generations. And with that, the proposition momentarily rests.
400 years ago. 400 years ago, my people were dragged from their homes, tribes, families, placed on floating wood, and shipped across the Atlantic to what would be later described as the most inhumane act of all time. Cold, dark, uncomfortable, cannot describe the trip in ships where whips did not fail to miss. Injustice, rape and disgrace, blood rains, brute, force, ignorance, hate in their veins. Sweat and tears, labor revealed, produce from king fields only for the esteemed. 400 years of eroding one's pride, culture, heritage, value. 400 years of the iron chain, stringing up, leaving bare. Oh, but they never cared. Why fight when you would be met with sharp blades? So don't you dare cry out in fear. Why not plan escape with the plaiting of one's hair? Oh, the drums, listen, dance, communicate. For tonight we fight a battle not even death could spare. Blue eyes, white skin, master said that's beauty within. But guess what? Black, brown, gold, royalty, reparations, we are owed. Them say hassa, but we say cassava. That's where we get our strength from to beat and conquer. For tonight, we're returning to Ghana. You may say, I'm a descendant of slaves because of the rich melanin that gushes from my pores. But I came to tell you tonight, I am not a slave. Rather the descendant of kings and queens. I am the embodiment of the divine. I do not chase, I align, I attract. What's meant for me already has my name on it. I am the personification of beauty, the expression of love, the creator of life, the acknowledgement of freedom. So go ahead, call me what you want, because when I die, bury me in the oceans where my ancestors jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage.
This is something that I wanted to discuss since Emancipation Day, but did you know that Britain only finished paying for slavery in 2015? Yes, 2015 as in 10 years ago. This fact was revealed in a since deleted tweet back on February 9, 2018 by the then Her Majesty's Treasury. In 1833, Britain borrowed 40% of its national budget, £20 million, to finance the Slavery Abolition Act. This act was the official end of British slavery and went into effect on August 1, 1834. The money that was borrowed was used to repay British slave masters for their quote-unquote loss of property. However, for the enslaved, there was no repayment and no form of compensation was offered. The amount that was borrowed, the £20 million, was equal to £2.2 billion in today's money. The since deleted tweet from Her Majesty's Treasury pointed out that the taxes paid by people today was used to repay the loan that paid the slave masters. This would mean that people from the Windrush generation and their descendants, people from Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago and other British colonies, would have helped to repay the loan taken out to pay the people who enslaved their ancestors. Using this video, I want to highlight that when people say that slavery was so long ago, 400 years ago, ancient history and we should get over it, we can see that it wasn't that long ago. If we look at a timeline of the history of Barbados, we can see that chattel slavery in Barbados lasted 207 years, whereas the time from emancipation in 1834 to today is only 191 years. So as a nation, we spent longer in slavery than we've spent free. I want you to think about that. Facts like these are why people have started a call for reparations, to correct an injustice done to us as a nation, a region, and a people. If you want to learn more about reparations and how you can be involved, click the link in my bio.
What you take, give it back. Stolen riches, give it back. My name, you changed that. Your hate, keep that. My land, where's that? Green pastures now flat. Your greed did that. My religion, you stopped that.
The African emancipation experience is a story of resistance and breakthrough, so that I could stand before you and speak to you because my ancestors paid the price for me. So when you look at me, see not just African beauty, but freedom in its entirety, where black is beautiful and freedom is opportunity, where people who look like me can be celebrated equally. Don't be distracted by my melanin. This skin that was once frowned upon is now flourishing. And if you know not to which I am speaking, then let the history lesson begin. To understand where we're going, we must first understand where we come from. So for some, this story begins at the bottom of a ship, forcefully migrated from the motherland as human cargo, an economical decision to work on a sugar plantation, and so slavery began. Beaten mercilessly, and regardless of sex, they were all treated as property. Can you imagine what it would be like to not be in control of oneself, to have your very life determined by somebody else? And if you want to talk about human rights violations, slavery is the definition. Punishment, imprisonment, torture, mutilation, sold without hesitation, separated from tribes to limit communication, and if you even harm an African ritual master could have your tongue for that. So on the plantation, it had none of that. We did what we were told, no questions asked. After all, slavery was an organized business and we were just labor. To work without receiving a dollar, branded and assigned Christian names didn't make it any better, but I am the prayers of my ancestors answered. A strong black African woman whose voice has the power to command even the boldest man, whose power comes from purpose, whose pain has inspired passion. So every African descendant walking confident continues to break the chains of a cycle. On August 1st, 1838, my generation was molded in hope, paid for in sacrifice, bought in tears. So when these heirs hear the words African emancipation,
All right, the judges are back and we have the decision. And by a unanimous poll, we know which team will be advancing to the quarterfinals of this illustrious competition and which team, unfortunately, after a brilliant run, ends their campaign here. So the motion before us once more reads, this House regrets the romanticization of repatriation in Pan-African movements. An interesting thing to note about motions that say regret is that it asks you to envision a world in which something did not happen and whether that world is better or is worse off. And so team proposition would have to imagine a world in which the romanticization of repatriation does not exist and then tell us if that world is better. Whereas team opposition would have to look at the world as it exists now, where that romanticization did exist, and then try to convince the judges that this is a better world than the one that proposition envisions. A unique quirk of this House regrets motion, but I think both teams, given all of those interesting debate, meta-analysis, and rules, did a really good job of contending with the debate, indicative of that fact. One school ends on 278 points, the other school ends on 285 points. This is a high scoring match. For many other matches, a score of 285 would have been a winning score. 285 is one of the leaderboard topping scores. So what did we get in this debate? Well, first we understood from Team Queen's College, Mahisa Badu points out to us that one, the problem is that repatriation has been framed in a way as if it is this magical, perfect solution. Africa is perfect. It's roses and green bushes, and we'll be able to tame the lambs, and we'll be able to do all the wonderful things that we can do. Mahisa says that all right, we had a little bit of technical difficulties, but that is resolved. So, as I was saying, Mahisa contends that the romanticization of the repatriation movement paints Africa in this beautiful light, and that's not the case. She tells us that, quite frankly, that there are areas where they don't want us to come back to their country. They tell us that they treat us as outsiders, and they gave the examples of the Jamaican Rastafarians and Rastafarians from other parts of the Caribbean, how they were discriminated against. They were called, the insurgents in other countries were called Rasta terrorists, even though they had no real connection to the Rastafarian movement, which is indicative of the fact that there exists within Africa a strife against us, right? That was a really interesting idea. Now we weigh that idea against what we got from Lady Fatima, right? They tell us that actually, not necessarily. The problem is that we are not having this romanticization to the greatest extent that we should have. And so these particular individuals are not being treated as one unity. They tell us that what happens is that we see individuals come from different areas and enter into these spaces and don't respect the indigenous tribes, and we get that division. And that's something that we don't want, and we think that is bad. That is actually an effect, Fatima tells us, of the fact that romanticization hasn't extended to the great extent that it really should have. They then contend that even if this does happen, that there are many cases in which it doesn't happen, in which we are welcomed for all the wonderful things that we can do. We weigh this idea and we think that in absence of deeper analysis of what we think was reasonably so, not one of the major clashes in the debate, that it was kind of a wash. We're not 100% sure whether they want us back or not. I guess some people do, I guess some people don't. What we get, however, is from Queen's College this idea that, well, quite frankly, we need this to do two things, right? Raphael tells us that when we romanticize repatriation, it undermines our Caribbean identity. Raphael tells us that, quite frankly, it tells us that our identity is inferior. It is incomplete. And that is not right. That is not fair, because our identity is valuable. Yes, he brings across the theory of double consciousness and use that to justify, to a large extent, the importance of ensuring that, or rather justify the idea that this will dilute our Caribbean identity. We thought that was a really interesting idea. We thought that was a really good, a decently substantiated claim. A little bit of a question on the judge's mind is, the extent to which our Caribbean identity is more valuable than our African identity. But Queen's College, we credit you greatly with this idea that our Caribbean identity is going to be greatly undermined if it is that we do this particular kind of movement. Right? We also hear from Queens that it distracts us from getting real repertory justice. This argument we credit to a far less extent than other arguments in the debate. One, inasmuch as repatriation is a part of reparation justice, in order to conclude that repatriation distracts us from reparatory justice, you need to do two things. You need to prove that repatriation is not reparatory justice. Because if it is, then pursuing repatriation cannot be distracting us from reparation, in as much as it is a part of reparation. So that's the first upstream thing that you need to prove, that repatriatory justice is distinct from reparation. And two, that repatriation, which is now distinct from reparations, distracts us from reparation. You did a little bit of the latter without proving first the prior. And so it undermined how greatly we could credit this idea, even though the judges thought that it was a really interesting and really important one. So from Team Fatima, we hear some responses to several of those ideas, while also hearing a showing up of their own claims. They tell us that the romanticization objectively results in a mindset, a movement, a fundamental shift in our perspective. It's not necessarily the outcomes of mass migration that makes us not regret this, but rather the sense of community that repatriation and the romanticization there have has engendered within us. And they tell us that creates some real wonderful and important thing. They tell us about the principle of Garveyism, which was a distinctive clash that exists in both sides, but we weigh Garveyism more on the side of opposition, in as much as it is distinct to the kind of nationalist agenda that Martin Luther King was presenting. We credit you on that. So what we get then is this idea that when we come together and galvanize together as one, that produces real results. And you tell us that that real result, which is distinct from the actual act of migration, is beneficial. You get real economic growth, you get the unifying sense of identity. We question, though, in the same way we question to you, Queen's College, we question Fatima. Why is my African identity more valuable than my Caribbean identity? See, Fatima tells me that I can have both, but I don't believe you, Fatima. I don't believe that I can have to the same extent my Caribbean identity and my African identity, in as much as romanticization of repatriation objectively means I am moving from one area where my identity is to another area where I think my identity should be. I think Queen's College does a good enough job of proving that to us. And so we don't think you get to have your cake and eat it too, Fatima. We think that objectively there is going to be some prioritization of one identity over the other. The question that still lingers in the minds of the judges from both teams is which identity, therefore, is more valuable. We don't fully understand why our African identity is more valuable than our Caribbean identity. And so both teams kind of needed to do a little bit more work right there on that particular issue. Weighing that again, ladies and gentlemen, against many other things that happened in this debate, who the judges would have concluded one team did better at proving their case to us, the judges. Another team needed to have done a little bit better to prove their substantive cases. Ladies and gentlemen, the team that wins this match and moves on to the quarterfinals of this competition on 285 points is the team in opposition, Fatima College.
Wow, y'all were amazing. We were so scared. We were so scared. Woo! Good job, good job.
Indeed, this was one of the more closely contended matches in this round. 278 to Queen's College. Not a score to scoff at by any means. Well played, Queen's College.
Wait, if I could ask a question, just for our own sake, did you credit the argument about Rastafarianism being premised on romanticization?
All right, so I can give you some feedback. Going a little bit further. We are strapped for time, but I will answer your question in another space. The short answer, yes, but not as greatly as it could have been with some more mechanization. All right. And so, ladies and gentlemen, your winners for this match, Fatima College. The best debater from this match also comes to us from Fatima, and that is the first speaker, Kennedy Valley.
Yeah, on behalf of the Queen's College team, congratulations to Fatima College. You guys were formidable opponents. Thank you much for the challenge and debate. Look forward to seeing more from you guys in the future.
Right. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. You all did great.
Yeah, boy.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, join us at 1 p.m. for the next match in this round, where we will see Grand Bahama Academy face off against York Castle High School from Jamaica. But just before we move on to the next round, I'd love to hear from our guest judge, and that match, of course, being at 11 a.m. I'd like to hear, of course, from our guest judge, Dr. Paul Gilbert.
Thanks, Ravon. Yeah, that was amazing. Both teams, really impressive. It was tight, lots of discussion. Super impressed by the argumentation, but also the amount of research that went in on both sides. Yeah, I think This is my second time judging one of these. I've enjoyed them both, but that was super close, and you were all fantastic. It would be a privilege to have any of you as students here at Sussex one day if we can tempt you over. Yeah, well done, and good luck in the next round, Fatima, and thanks so much, Queens. That was really, really strong as well.
All right, and thank you, Dr. Gilbert. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.